Thank you for telling me that. Thank you very much. Yeah. It's interesting. Some of them, like the ones that you just pulled out, I think some of them have a whole mental glacier under the tip, and some of them maybe have an emotional glacier under the tip. And the ones that you mentioned, the Now I Am the One with Eyes, I spent so many years studying feminist theory and women poets of the 19th century and thinking about what made them different from the other kinds of poets. You know, why is a poet like Lydia Sigourney, the sweet singer of Hartford, how is she different from John Keats? And why is it that everybody understands John Keats, but for a long time nobody could understand Lydia Sigourney and they just thought she was writing sentimental stuff? You know, what exactly was going on there? And I thought about it so much, and I thought about seeing and being seen, and that so much of the poetesses was about being seen but not about learning how to have eyes. And I think that's partly what's underlying that Now I Am the One with Eyes, but of course it has to get processed into a feeling before it can come out in poetry. So, but I think it's all still there, the thought. But then the other, did I have a face and did it lie in shadow? I mean, I think that's the opposite. That's like, I think of all the, you know, oh God, I want to say decades, or at least hours and hours of misery I went through as a young woman, going through all my different love relationships and trying to work things out, and all the emotional agony I went through. I must have been more than average, I have no idea. But but then that feeling of, did I have a face, and learning, you know, before I ever knew about therapy or counseling, and I didn't know how to exist in a relationship. I always felt I was being annihilated, and that feeling of, did I have a face, all the agony I went through. But yet I think in order to write it into the poem, it almost had to get transformed into a thought, into an idea. So it's almost like those little nuggets happen at the intersection between the feeling and the thought, whatever direction it's going in, that there's this kind of moment when they pass each other and connect, and there's a spark. So thank you for pulling those moments. I love infected. I love that. It's a perfect word for it, because it is kind of a contagion, and a good contagion. Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad. I love reading it, and as you say, so much of it is just being able to appreciate it yourself. I'll never forget hearing Stanley Kunitz read, and he would sway back and forth, and he just clearly having the best time. And I've always wanted to kind of try it. If we change as she is changing, if she changes as we change, if she changes, I am changing. Who is changing as I bend down to what the sky has sent us? Is she changing or the same? I've always wanted to do that. I never did before. It's on camera. Thank you. Did that work? That was really fun. It helped me to get into it. I got to remember that. But yeah, it's true. But the other thing I want to say is that I had an experience with a book group. The book Calendars that's going around is a book that I've read from many times, and I often talk to people afterwards, and they're very receptive to the poems. And then my publisher said, why don't we do a book group? So Calendars was bought by the people in the book group, and then I showed up after they had read it. And it was a completely different experience, because I walked in and I said, and it was like, it felt different than I expected. And I was like, so, well, did you like the book? And they're like, well, we didn't really know what to do with the book. And I was like, wow. And then I thought, well, did you read it aloud? Well, no, we didn't do that. Oh, well, because people don't think a lot of times nowadays, poetry read aloud. They don't think it, because a lot of poetry is meant to be contemplated alone on the page. A lot of free verse, the William Carlos Williams, it's really about looking at the beautiful white spaces on the page. It's almost like a scroll. It was so influenced. Sorry, that's my phone with this funny train whistle on it. But it's like one of those scrolls you're supposed to look at and contemplate. They were very influenced by Asian poetics, and it's so different, I think, to hear poems aloud, but people didn't think of it. So with the poems that I write in meter, what I'm really hoping is that people will tap back into the hearing part, because when people would read Shakespeare or Browning or Tennyson, especially in the old days, they didn't have to have Shakespeare there to read them aloud, to hear, because the meter itself is like a code that gives you that experience even when the poet isn't there. And that's what I'm hoping. That's why I put so much love and work into my rhythms, because I want them to be on the page encapsulated so that anytime you could read it aloud to yourself or read it aloud to someone else and have the same experience as if I were right in front of you reading it, without having to watch a video of me or something. I mean, so you could actually feel it in your mouth and interpret it yourself as if you were playing a piece of music on the piano. A beautiful piece of music. You can make it your own, and the bones of the music are still there. And that's how I write my poems, so that if one of you reads them aloud, the bones will be there and you'll have the pleasure of giving it your own interpretation. Well, yeah, in a way, I think, well, a lyric poem certainly is. I mean, I still pay attention to Aristotle's 3 modes of poetry, and I should let you all know that if you're interested, I published a book just last year called A Poet's Craft. It's 700 pages. It's everything I know about poetry, starting my whole life's worth of poetry. And people say it's an accessible, fun read. So if you're interested, A Poet's Craft. But I have a chapter in there called 3 Modes of Poetry. And I really do respect Aristotle's 3 modes. And he said that there are lyric poetry, and there's meditative poetry, and there's dramatic poetry. Or narrative, I guess I should say narrative, because meditative is a kind of lyric. So lyric, narrative, and dramatic. And I actually write in all of those 3 types. So I think a lyric poem like that one really is like a mini dramatic performance. And then dramatic poetry is obviously a dramatic performance because it's a play. But I think a narrative poem is a little different, a poem that tells a story. But maybe that's dramatic too. Yeah, I think I see your point. I mean, would it be a song ever? Or is a song a dramatic performance too? So yeah, I guess it is. That makes sense. And then if you're reading it alone, it could be a dramatic performance for yourself. I've thought about that question a lot. And my answer is different than you'll hear from a lot of people, but I think it's right. I think it's right. In fact, I'm positive it's right. My feeling is that poets like to have challenges. They like difficulty because it's what they do. Poets are partly puzzle solvers. I think the poet's mind is partly what you want to do is make something clear and beautiful out of conflict and paradox and difficulty. And my feeling is that in every culture all over the world, for almost all of human history, the difficulty and the challenge has been provided through form, meter, rhyme. If you go back at those Celtic poetry forms, they are unbelievably complicated. I mean, there's one poem in here called Brigid, which is in a little Celtic form. It's 8 lines. It took months to write that poem. And that's, and after you tackle something like that, you understand why the Celtic bards were the only people who were respected and revered so much that not only were they the only ones who could criticize the king, but they were the only ones who could wear these special rainbow-colored robes, and they were revered because you have to really have a very powerful brain and a very powerful soul to be able to deal with form at that level, especially when there's no paper. I mean, it's a very profound thing. And it strikes me that poetry began to get so obscure at exactly the same time that poets stopped writing in meter. And I feel that the difficulty of understanding it is a replacement for the difficulty of meter instead. And I know that's true because when I started writing in meter, my poetry became much less difficult, much more accessible, because I was getting my difficulty Jones off on on the meter rather than on linguistic obscurity. And why did they abandon meter? Well, I have a theory about that too. I think it was partly made easy by the invention of the typewriter, but I think more than that, it was the fact that iambic pentameter had become so dominant that it was the only meter that was respected. And Milton, Shakespeare, Browning, Tennyson, all of them. And it had gotten to the point where in 1950, John Crowe Ransom said the only reason Emily Dickinson was not a major poet is because she didn't write iambic pentameter. I mean, you couldn't even be a major poet unless you wrote iambic pentameter. So the dominance of iambic pentameter was so overwhelming that they, as Ezra Pound said, to break the pentameter was what they wanted to do. Well, in the process, they broke all the meters because the other meters didn't even have a foothold. They were relegated to children's poetry. The Night Before Christmas is an Anapaes, the occasional odd thing like Evangeline and Dactyls or Hiawatha and long trochees, but those were rarities. And I'm now in the process of editing a book that's going to be it's going to be called Measure for Measure, the Music of Poetry, and it's Random House is going to put it out in the Little Everyman series, and it's going to be a reader of all the different meters to kind of remind people again of what these meters sound like. And it's very hard to find examples. You have to go back and find books that are out of print. So I think that's why they abandoned meter, because there was nothing but iambic pentameter that anybody knew. It was 90% of the poetry that was in meter was iambic pentameter. They toppled iambic pentameter, there was a vacuum, nothing to fill it. So, and then of course there was the influence of Asian poetry and everything else. But I think what was lost in that whole clearing of the decks, which was great and very important, but what was lost was that immediate accessibility of meter. Not all poets like meter. I think some of them do a wonderful job writing in free verse, but there are a lot of poets who I know for a fact, because I teach them all the time at Stonecoast, they're writing meter without knowing it, they're slipping into it unconsciously, they really want to write it but they don't know how because they've never learned, because their teachers didn't know how, and they've never read anything in meter because it's not around unless it's iambic pentameter, and that just sounds so old. So, people are in a bind right now, and I think they're getting their difficulty Jones by writing obscure language.
Great answer.
I've really been pondering this stuff for a long time, because when I started out I was really confused by these questions too. I just didn't know what the heck was going on. It was different than the poetry that I grew up with, and it wasn't the same animal. And if it weren't for form, I don't think I would have survived, because I physically need it as a poet. I met an opera composer who was obsessed with Tsetsaeva, and she asked me to write a libretto based on her writings in her life, and I did, and it was produced in New York, and it's you can find the review online, but because of the copyright laws, there's no video of it. But the script is around, and hopefully it'll be done again sometime. And it was very satisfying to do. I wove together a lot of her own writings, but I put a lot of my own writings in too, and I was just talking to someone about it yesterday. Her life was so tragic, and I felt that the opera gave me a chance to redeem her and to find something in her life that transcended. And so I'll share with you a little bit that I wrote for the ending. And yeah, her poetry is just amazing, especially translated by Feinstein's translation. Yeah, Elaine Feinstein. But this is my own little tribute to her. And of course, when I was working with the composer, she'd say, well, I need more stuff with this tune. So I had the tune in my head. Mother Marina, you are a cool well, dreaming of life in the deep breath of words. Spin in your triumph and turn in your pain. Mother Marina, Mother Marina. 'Cause she is a stream. It was performed, yes, by Lauren Flanagan. And she sings with the Met, and it was the music is by Deborah Drattel. And the score is there, and it was done in New York. Yeah, for me, writing the libretto was very satisfying, and it goes so well with poetry, and I had a lot of fun.
It'd be quite exciting to do it.
It is. Well, it's like a dream, and and you get to put all your different parts of yourself out there on the stage and have them all speak in poetry, and then the composer kept saying, "You've got to add more here. You've got to dramatize it up," because I was so used to pulling back and being restrained and modern and being cool, and she was like, no, somebody's dying, you can't just have like silence on the stage, you've got to have them like, I'm dying. I'm like, okay, let me go for it. Very cathartic.
Let loose.
So I guess it's about time to wind up, and this is I think a happier space to end on than some of the other places we've touched today. We've really covered it all, right? So you've just been so much fun to talk to. Thank you all. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.